Hi, I'm Ed Ghilardi. In this series of videos, I want to examine several church doctrines using only types and shadows of the Bible. The doctrine we'll be looking at here is that of original sin. There are several different versions of this doctrine, but the one I'm interested in is the one that says we're sinful at birth. We've inescapably inherited the sin from Adam and Eve that's been passed down through the ages. We inherit that at birth and we're sinful. Now, if you're wondering what types and shadows are, or indeed how they can teach us New Testament doctrines, I invite you to look at the introductory video I did on types and shadows. But real briefly here, the New Testament has lots to say about the relationship between the law and the church. Hebrews 8 refers to the law as a copy and shadow of the heavenly things, or the church. In Galatians 3 and 4, Paul likens that relationship to that as to how we raise our children from the youth stage to adults. We give our young kids a set of elemental principles, and all these principles point directly to the final lessons that we want them to eventually learn. We give them lessons like wipe your feet, say please and thank you, wash your hands before you eat. All of those principles point directly to the final lessons we want them to learn, such as love, honor, and respect. God did exactly the same thing in the law. He gave us a set of elemental principles that point directly to the teachings he wanted us to learn in the church. Let me give you an example. In Exodus 21:33 and 34, it says, "If a man opens a pit or digs a pit and does not cover it over, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restitution." That's an elemental principle. What's it teaching us? Well, we have a responsibility to our neighbor. So what's the final teaching in the church that he wants us to understand? It's part of, thou shalt love the Lord your God with all your heart, and all your soul, and all your mind, and all your strength, and your neighbor as yourself. So when we use types and shadows, we get a picture. We have a very clear picture, in this case, of an open pit, not guarded, not covered over, and our neighbor's ox falls into it. That's a teaching that is hard to argue with. We can't argue with a picture. We've wrangled for centuries over words, different verses, but the shadows present a picture that tell a very clear story. So why am I interested in church doctrines in the first place? The main reason for all the church divisions has been differences in church doctrine. We're weak as a church because we're so divided, and we can't stand against a common enemy. We don't have a common voice. I believe it's essential that we get back to Christian unity. Is it important that everyone believes the very same thing about every doctrine? No, and nor will we ever. But the differences in some doctrines is very important, so it's critical that we look at these. Just before we go to original sin, I want to say something to help strengthen your understanding of these shadows and how they explain church doctrine. So recall the initial shadow that I gave in the introductory video. It's the shadow of the Feast of Passover and Unleavened Bread. And I want to review, there's several details in that doctrine, in that teaching rather, but I only want to go over 3 of them just for sake of time. So here they are. The first point we'll look at is that every Israelite was commanded to put the blood of their Passover lambs around their doors that day in Egypt. That night the death angel would pass through the land, and every home that had the blood on it, the death angel would pass over them, and they would be spared. But wherever there was no blood, the firstborn of both man and beast in those homes were put to death. Having the blood applied to their homes set them apart. In the New Testament, when it talks about being set apart, it uses the term sanctify. Here's what Hebrews 13:12 says. Therefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people through his own blood, suffered outside the gate. The second point we'll consider is that they had to remove all the leaven from their homes for the next 7 days. Leaven, you see, was a shadow of sin or worldliness. So the picture here is when they applied the blood of the Lamb, they were spared and their sins were taken away. Here's what 1 Corinthians 5, 7, and 8 says. Clean out the old leaven so that you may be a new lump, just as you are in fact unleavened. For Christ our Passover also has been sacrificed. Therefore let us celebrate the feast, not with the old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. The final point is that they had to bring in the first fruits of their barley harvest. The promise under the law was that if you brought in the very first of your ripened grain to the priest, the rest of your crops would be richly blessed. Christ is our first fruits. He was the first to raise from the grave, never to die again. Here's the promise that we have in 1 Corinthians 15:23. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ all will be made alive, but each in his own order, Christ the firstfruits, after that those who are Christ at his coming. So as we look at these three elemental principles from the law, we see that if we obey God, if we apply the blood of Christ to our lives, all our past sins are taken away. And when we die, we will raise with him for eternity. That's the gospel message. Now let's turn our attention to the law and see what we can understand about original sin. Consider the first sins of each new institution that God created. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve were the first and only ones to sin. God gave them a death penalty and put them out of the garden. The first sin under the Mosaic law was Nadab and Abihu. They were stricken dead on the spot. The first sin as the Israelites entered the Promised Land was Achan, and he and his whole family were put to death. And finally, the first sin in the new church was Ananias and Sapphira, and they were stricken dead. What was it about these first sinners that God judged them so harshly? The truth is that that's the same penalty that we all deserve. The penalty for sin is death, and God did not tolerate ongoing sin in people's lives. That's why he made such an elaborate system of forgiveness under the law, so that they could all be cleansed. So surely, if original sin as we formulated exists, there had to be a sin sacrifice at or very near the birth of every infant. So as we look through the law, we see sacrifices for stealing, for lying, for bearing false witness, for oppressing a stranger. There was a sacrifice for everything. So what about a sacrifice for the newborn? Well, there was a sin sacrifice near the birth of every boy or girl. So let's have a look at that. That was in Leviticus 12, 6 and 7. And it begins, when the days of her purification are completed, for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the doorway of the tent of meeting a 1-year-old lamb for a burnt offering, and a young pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. So there's the sin offering. But at this point, we don't know for what or for who this offering is. But it goes on. Then he shall offer it before the Lord and make atonement for her, and she shall be cleansed from the flow of her blood. This is the law for her who bears a child, whether a male or a female. This sin sacrifice was for the mother. It was not for the child, and it was because of the flow of her blood. So, and look wherever we will under the law, there simply was not a sin sacrifice for the infant. So the doctrine of original sin, as we formulated here, simply cannot be true. In a future video, when we consider the doctrine of water baptism, I'll tell you when I believe the teaching of original sin began. But for now, if you're one of many people that hold strongly to this view, I urge you not to throw the shadows out. Jesus himself taught using shadows. Consider Matthew 5:27 and 28. He said, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." The shadow element was adultery. The church teaching that it was pointing to was lust. God made the shadows, and he placed them in the Bible for a reason. So rather than question God or the shadows, I urge you to have a fresh look at your understanding of this teaching of original sin. It's a teaching that, after all, is never once mentioned in the Bible. So stay tuned to future videos, and we'll look at another doctrine, and we'll let the shadows speak.